Welcome to Elevating Consciousness. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is Ari Nielsen, a practitioner with an eclectic background that spans Reichian breathwork, cybernetics, unschooling, Dzogchen, and improv. He spent over a decade living in the heart of the community surrounding the prime representative of California New Age spirituality of the 70s, Adi Da. He also edited the collected works of Bruce Di Marsico, an existential therapist whose philosophy can be summed up as be happy and do what you want. Currently, he writes a publication on Substack that elucidates a radically liberating orientation to life, which he calls Searchless Responsiveness. Enjoy. Ari Nielsen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for coming on. I just want to set a bit of context before we dive in. So I met you through Evolving Ground, an online community for Vajrayana practitioners, which we're both a part of. And we haven't had many interactions, but I've had a chance to read a lot of what you wrote in the community forum, as well as in your Substack. And I was intrigued by the precision you bring when talking about spirituality and human transformation. And I think a lot of that makes sense when I learned that you have an engineering background. But I've been getting my mind blown by your writings on what you call searchless responsiveness, which seems to be heavily influenced by Dzogchen. And I'd love to dive deeper into the ideas in your writings, but maybe first you can speak a little bit about your journey into spirituality, some of the pivotal moments, teachers, philosophies that you feel impacted you the most.
How long a version do you want? Do you want a 2-minute, 5-minute, half hour, 3 hour?
5-10 minutes, but whatever, just whatever feels good. I could always interrupt you. So yeah.
So I think my first encounter with spiritual stuff occurred when I was a teenager. And I was was typical of that era, the mid 80s. I was really into playing rock guitar, and I had my favorite rock guitar stuff to play. Like, for example, I had a big book of Rush music and played Rush on guitar. And there was a guitarist who I was really fond of called Robert Fripp, and his style was he was with a band called King Crimson, which was a progressive rock band. And I was really into progressive rock then. I listened to Genesis and things like that. And anyway, so I was really into him. And then I saw one day in a guitar magazine, like you could write off to get a pamphlet from him. And it was a pamphlet on guitar technique. And it was a pamphlet that turned out on, I wrote off and I paid whatever it was, a pretty small amount, who knows, $7 or something, and got this very nicely printed thing on discipline. Came back. So it's really all about the attitude, which in Fripp's concept helped one become a better guitar player. And I would eventually go see him in Manhattan and spend a weekend with him. Turns out that Robert Fripp was actually a hardcore Gurdjieffian. Now, Gurdjieff may not be a spiritual figure that many are familiar with these days, but he was one of the whole crowd of early 20th century importing Eastern concepts into Western concepts sort of people. Theosophists were another group. And theosophists may be known through things like Waldorf schools today. That's sort of their remnants. So it was Eastern spirituality, not necessarily in the imported into the West, but not necessarily of a clear genre, because I believe Gurdjieff had some influences from Persia, e.g., Iran, and it definitely wasn't from the Buddhist or the Hindu lineage. It was some other Eastern lineages that were maybe more shamanistic, maybe more other stuff. Anyway, so that got me looking at that sort of thing. And then I went to college. Now, in college, there was a professor there, Ashok Gangadin, who taught courses such as Intro to Vedantic Philosophy and Intro to Buddhist Philosophy. He's a very well-respected academic in these areas. So I spent some time there in college studying the Eastern philosophies from an academic standpoint. So I should really rewind here, because when I was like in third grade, we had to write a book report. And I found this book in my parents' home called something like Buddhism, Taoism, Zen, the Three Paths or something. It was some book from the 1950s. It was actually an art book. And it was like about every other page was a black and white photograph of some art. So I wrote a book report back when I was in third grade on these items. And that was my sort of actual first introduction to these things as formal institutional items. I grew up conservative Judaism. So it was very much a different thing that is about the practices. It's not about meditation. It's not about beliefs. It's not related to either Christianity or to Buddhism in most of its respects, because its fundamental approach is what's called orthopraxis, or right practice, as opposed to orthodoxy, or right belief. And it's not concerned, Judaism in general is not concerned with, for example, many people think that to be Jewish, you need to believe in God, and actually, no, that's not true. You need to do this stuff. And the question of whether you believe it or not is completely irrelevant. So anyway, we're going to skip forward now. We're in college. And so sometime after college, I was wandering in Philadelphia. And I came across, and Philadelphia I'd often wander 40 blocks to the riverfront. I'm about 25 now. And because it was a pleasant walk, I'd walk 40 blocks. It was a scenic walk. They had a great Greek restaurant at the riverfront. I loved Greek food. Like, they don't have good Greek food on the West Coast in my experience. I live on the West Coast now, and they had great, Northeast, all the Greek immigrants, fantastic Greek food. And there's also a very, very large spiritual bookstore, which I checked. It's still there today. I don't know how large it was, down on Fifth Street. And it was just like back in Arrow, you could have a massive Barnes and Nobles type store that was just spiritual books. So I'd often end up like eating Greek food, hanging out there, going to the art theater, seeing the art movies. And I encountered more stuff there. And so one day, wandering in Philadelphia at a used bookstore, I came across right next to books about Jonestown. The Jonestown incident where Jim Jones in Santa Rosa, California, brought a whole bunch of alternative spiritual folks down to South America. The government investigated. He arranged a cyanide poisoning at the end of the whole thing. They all died. Hence the phrase, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid." Anyway, I found a book by someone else. Well, I liked that book though, but I found a book by someone else who was called Dafri John, and Dafri John, and I eventually joined that community as a in-person physical thing. Meaning, I moved to Washington. I moved into the community in Washington D.C. initially, then to the community, even more central community in California. Now, Dafri John is he was the top quality representation of American religion. So in the 70s, you had people like the three big guys in the 70s were Chagya Trungpa, who represented Vajrayana in America, Rajneesh or Osho, who represented Hinduism, American Hinduism, and the third big guy was Dafri John. Now, Dafri John actually created much less scandal. So therefore, he's been pretty much a memory hold today. But he was equally as big in the time. And it just goes to show if you want to be remembered, you need to create big scandal. He only ever created pretty small scandal. If I had to say where his lineage went today is, there's a guy who writes on spirituality, Ken Wilber. And Ken Wilber's early books were completely basically trying to explain Dafri John's stuff in a clearly in a more academic context, and that was acknowledged. It wasn't like something that was hidden. It was acknowledged that by him himself that was basically the first 15 years of his writing. Anyway, that was I'll call it real traditional spiritual life. Get up in the morning, meditate. In the evening, meditate. Do puja or ritual worship. Do every day. Do yoga and qigong. Have do cooperate as a community to bring things into life. I when I first got there, I lived in the back of a spiritual bookstore, actually. So there was, study as an element integrated with all these other things. And Dafri John was really into quote the great traditions. So he encouraged study of the entire tradition of humankind, including Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and of course, being tantric, we also did really good partying. The sort of partying that you cannot do nowadays without creating scandal. I think the internet has meant there's no privacy, and therefore the idea of a bunch of spiritual track practitioners getting together privately in their own private space that they own and doing freaky things is much less or freaky sex and or drug things. It's much less possible today than it was in a previous era. Like I don't really hear about people doing a lot of sex and drug use in a considered and spiritually potent manner these days. So now we're like I was with him for over a decade till he died. So we get to fast forward here. This will make the story quicker. So the question is, what happens after Dafri John dies? Two things is one is I worked a long time on a project and released a 1,000-page book of edited 1,000-page book and wrote about 15% of the material of a existential psychotherapist of the 70s called Bruce Di Marsico, who created something called the option method. And that lineage is around today in I guess I'm the official lineage holder of the mystical side of it, but that lineage is around these days as bestowed by his widow. But that lineage is around today in I'll call it degenerate forms because it fed into New Ageism in various ways. For example, it did become a element in The Secret, the epitome of noxious bullshit New Ageism. And I recently saw it, actually. There's this book that was popular a few years ago, Existential Kink. And in the appendix, it listed 5 sources. And Bruce Di Marsico's The Option Method was explicitly like maybe the first of the 5 sources that it was varying on. So it's still around as a lineage. And I had during that period, I was starting a new family. My teenage daughter's now 15 years old, so I've had a family for a while. And now we get to close the intersection with Artem Zen. Okay, so because before Charlie Auberry founded Evolving Ground, they were director of studies for a group called the Arrow Terror, which is a Vajrayana Buddhist group. And they started mentoring me in Vajrayana Dzogchen I think it was about 2017. And then at some point after they started mentoring me, they started evolving ground, and I'll call it brought me over there. So that is the relatively summary spiritual history. There's so many elements I've left out here. For example, more than a decade of fantastic experience with Reichian breathwork, and Wilhelm Reich was one of the three main students of Freud, along with Jung and maybe Pearls, and he created the whole branch that is today seen as somatic psychotherapy. So every somatic psychotherapy in the Western tradition clearly and unequivocally traces back to Wilhelm Reich. The most classic version of it, though, is purely breathwork with no content, no talking, no describing, no interpreting. And of course, you can always characterize things like having a family and growing up in the rural South and what that entails as their own contributions that are absolutely significant. So in conclusion, we talk about searchless responsiveness. If we trace the lineage of each of those terms, searchless is actually a term of Dafri John's. He used that. It is his coinage, that term. I use it in a generally relatively similar, though not exactly similar sense than Dafri John did, but close enough that it should absolutely be credited to him. And as for responsiveness, this is something that perhaps is a translation of maybe what Wilhelm Reich called organismic responsiveness, meaning the inherent capacity of a physical organism to respond as an organism in entirely, meaning as a body, as not as a where the mind is part of the body and responding as a whole being to the degree in which there is no separation between the body and the world.
Yeah, I want to dive deeper into searchless responsiveness, but I want to kind of just backtrack a little bit of some of it. You said a lot there, and just want to kind of double tap on some of those things. You mentioned Khorde, and he's actually, I think he's a pretty big figure in a lot of the spaces that I move in. Like his name constantly pops up. Somebody that I've recently had on the podcast, Layman Pascal, actually wrote a whole book about him and how he's like impacted his life, and he's kind of a somewhat big figure in the spaces that I move. So that's interesting. You mentioned Judaism and how it's not about beliefs. I know very little about Judaism, even though I come from that background. I come from a Jewish background. Like as a child, we used to celebrate, like my family was never like religious, but we celebrated certain holidays, and like I went to synagogue and stuff like that. So it's actually interesting that you say that it's not about beliefs and it's about practice. There's other things that you mentioned that was interesting about. You mentioned the three big figures of, and you said Dafri John, and I think more people know him as Arida.
Yeah, so I was using the historically appropriate name because he's actually went through. It was something like Franklin Jones, then it was Bubba Free John, and that's actually my favorite one of them, Bubba Free John, then Da Free John, then maybe it was Da Kalki, then Da Avabasa, and then Adi Da. And I know I have I know I've left about 5 of them out there, but he had a good discipline of regularly changing his name, and that was that represents yeah, that represents not being fixed to a certain point of view. It's like time for a slight shift in view, time for a shift in name.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned the other two, Chogyam, Trungpa, and Osho. And it was just interesting when you brought those three up. I'm like, I know less about Adida, but I know he was also controversial, maybe less controversial than Chogyam and Osho. But it's funny how like the three main Eastern main like Western spirituality teachers just had so much controversy around them. I think it kind of speaks to how the guru model is just something about it. It always like creates bad dynamics. Even it's not necessarily like the teacher's fault. It's just something about that model that seems to, produce bad outcomes a lot of times. And perhaps there's good outcomes too, because it seems like you've had good experiences living in his community. But I think it's just interesting how those are like the three figures.
I think there's something interesting about the whole risk versus reward in spirituality, and how, like in finance, these two are somewhat related to each other. Namely, a riskless spirituality is also going to be maybe have very little reward. And in the existential sense, an example of a riskless spirituality might be the most anodyne version of pop New Age philosophy.
Yeah.
And a high reward one is likely to be high risk. Now, you can talk about what's called the efficient horizon, meaning you might say, here's a spiritual practice. Is there anything that has less risk for this amount of reward? Because you could have two things that have the same amount of reward, and one of them has a much higher risk. Well, obviously, the one with the same reward, the one with less risk is better. But you can't, if you actually, instead of saying what's the least risk I can take for this amount of reward, instead you say how can I get risk down to zero? Well, in doing that, you're going to get your reward shrunken also. And I think that's very true in spiritual life. And in the 70s, there was a higher tolerance for risk, which led to more people getting, I'll call it, big spiritual happenings. The risk also meant there was a greater number of people who had highly adverse effects and led to calls for removing them. This has led to safer spirituality, but also generally less potent spirituality in our current age. And unfortunately, these two cannot be completely delinked.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. What do you feel like? Like, is it the fact that there's like this surrender and this ability to maybe let go of your autonomy somehow? Is because it seems in evolving ground that's a big thing. We talk about autonomy, but it seems like the risk is about like releasing the autonomy or like releasing your own ego in some regard.
Well, in that particular model, when it's working right, what's going to happen is that a person is going to be put up against their edge. Now, whether that means in any given case can differ, but it's being up against your edge will often be unpleasant. And if it doesn't work out well, then there can be resentment if you don't fully follow through. And let me try to make that more concrete. And let me try to make it saying that, let me actually try to make up an example that doesn't use sex or drugs like that. Let's say someone is a chillaxed hippie type. The teacher says, you know what? The guru says, wear a suit, get a corporate job. So, you need, that's your path. And they do that. And they do it for a while, and after 3 years, they feel empty and hollow, and they just flame out and say, "Fuck it, man! I just want to be a bicycle repairman." So, the guru cannot, even they cannot foresee the future, though I'm saying that from an objective sense because in many traditions it is thought they can. but honestly, that was a reasonable piece of advice for that person to further their spiritual development, to give them a sort of foundation of discipline and social capabilities, and it didn't work out. And 3 years went by, and now you might say the person may feel 3 years of their life was wasted. So the thing is, if you've ever interacted with a doctor or an accountant, you know that even an expert is not always right. I think a lot of people have that with medical care, where people who are actually quite authentically caring doctors who are very high skilled still can make wrong calls. So, and then the question becomes a malpractice lawsuit, and the court decides whether this was intentional malfeasance or not. And honestly, in some sense, a guru, the best at its best, a guru might be like a wise and skilled doctor. They may have an intervention, but like their intervention may actually work for a lot of people, but it may actually disastrously fail occasionally. And then the question is, and then, in the court of public opinion, there's a malpractice lawsuit, so to speak, whether this guru did malpractice or not. And of course, in medicine, a lot of malpractice does happen. So with gurus, a lot of malpractice does happen, but not all adverse outcomes are malpractice.
Yeah, I think also like sometimes the problem is like when you take to teachings and just apply it to every area of your life, and take like the guru's advice and apply it to every area of your life, and it's like it doesn't necessarily cross over to every area. And like they might have a specialty in this particular area and see where you're caught up in a certain pattern, but it doesn't mean that they can tell you what to do in every area of your life.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And there's a lot of cultural baggage in the guru model, which is slightly different than expert model, because imagine if doctors were culturally considered to be always right, never wrong. And probably this is so in some cultures.
I think it was for a while.
If you didn't follow the directions exactly, precisely, what the fuck's wrong with you? If you push back, what the fuck's wrong with you? So these are not necessarily not intrinsic to you can imagine a evolved guru model that does include this authoritarianism, but culturally, the guru model often has this sort of authoritarian, problematic authoritarianism baked in.
For sure. So, you mentioned also Bruce Di Marsico, and my understanding is that his main idea is that happiness is our true nature, and that when we experience something unpleasant, we start to give ourselves reasons to why we should be unhappy. So in a way, we're like layering or constructing misery over happiness. And I feel like that's also like a Buddhist idea. I feel like that's kind of like something in Buddhism, that it's like, oh, happiness is intrinsic, like we're intrinsically happiness and we create our own kind of unhappiness. But yeah, maybe you could speak a little bit more to his philosophy. And yeah.
Sure. So one thing from a lineage standpoint, Bruce Di Marsico's lineage is in some sense Western existentialism, and also American pragmatism, like William James. And it is not a Westernization of Buddhist philosophy or Westernization of any Eastern philosophy. One of my I think a little digression here. One of my Dzogchen teachers, not Charlie, someone a different one, is highly critical of Vajrayana and considers Dzogchen to have merely flowered in that context. And Bruce Di Marsico is the closest Western writer who comes from a purely Western lineage, in my opinion, to the Dzogchen, I'll call it, view. Anyway, what is this view? It is that, yes, that happiness is intrinsic. But what is happiness? So happiness in a sense is that it is okay to be wanting and feeling whatever you're wanting and feeling. The end. So, or more generally, they said happiness is defined by any person. So the question wasn't really about, his question really wasn't about happiness, but unhappiness. How does unhappiness happen? Because happiness as the intrinsic situation isn't really an interesting question. Yeah, it happens. The question is, how does unhappiness happen? Why do we get this unhappiness? And the fundamental answer was, unhappiness is merely, I'll say merely, the belief that there are conditions required for our happiness. The truth is there are no conditions required. And so the release of unhappiness is merely the release of the belief that there are conditions required for happiness. I'll pause there and see if you have any questions about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you shared another article of somebody like wrote out the method, and like I've followed some of that stuff in my own life, like when I was feeling unhappy or something was popping up, and it's interesting, but it does remind me a lot of CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy, like challenging beliefs, challenging that you need to be unhappy. Like, do you need to be unhappy?
I'm going to distinguish it from CBT in that CBT is, in my understanding, is looking for an optimal frame. It's something like you have a not useful perspective on things. It's going to challenge that and probably to replace it, though, with a better perspective. The option method does not aim to replace any frame with a better frame or any understanding with a better understanding. It has no opinion on any belief that is not problematic for a given individual. It's only there to help bust or pop beliefs on that one's happiness is conditioned, and then what comes from that is whatever comes from that. I can give you a dramatic contrast that's more concrete. If, let's say, someone was worried that they had fantasies of killing their neighbor, cognitive behavioral therapy, I believe, might be try to get them to see that their neighbor is not someone who needs to be killed. That basically root out the belief that their neighbor is someone to be killed. The option method would ask, why are you unhappy that you want to kill your neighbor? Now, eventually, pursuing that path through all the layers, one of two things are going to happen. Either the person's going to be like, realize that, oh, I want to kill my neighbor, and that's fine. And I don't want to act on it, and that's fine. Or they realize, oh, I don't really want to kill my neighbor, and that's fine. Or a third possibility, maybe they find out that, oh, I do want to kill my neighbor, and I actually want it enough that I'm happy to take the consequence of that of going to jail and being executed. In that case, a person may kill their neighbor, go to jail and be executed, but that's not a problem. I mean, that sort of person probably can do it anyway. But if someone really wants to do it, if someone is truly a sociopath, a violent sociopath, then they're a violent sociopath. So be it. And we as a society handle violent sociopaths how we handle it, but it just is what it is. So I think that's very dramatically different than cognitive behavioral therapy, where the final option would be considered completely verboten. We cannot have a violent sociopath deciding that their chosen path is to kill someone and then be executed. but the option method would actually be fine with that. The thing is, many people think they're violent sociopaths, but actually they're not. So 99% of people who came in with that point of view would realize that, oh, I'm not a violent sociopath. There's nothing to do here. There's no problem. I'm a guy who has fantasy about killing his neighbor and no desire to act on it. I can let be and move on in life.
Yeah. So you said that he came to the Dzogchen view in a way too, because the Dzogchen view also sees happiness as being intrinsic. And I think you mentioned
it's called Kadag. Kadag is the technical term for intrinsic happiness.
Okay, and you mentioned another Dzogchen teacher. Is that Keith Dowman?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So my understanding that searchless responsiveness is very similar to Dzogchen in the sense that it's like an orientation without an orientation, or like a view without a view. Or I think sometimes the Dzogchen view it's called like the view that frees you from all views. Is that right?
Well, the thing about Dzogchen's actually a whole bunch of lineages, and there's one of the big distinctions. Some of the big lineages are, for example, there is highly institutionalized Dzogchen. So, by analogy, you can think of the Christian mystic versus the local priest who's a functionary in the church. Those are both Christians. Dzogchen is often talked about as if it is a thing, but actually it's more like something on the level of a Protestant denomination almost, in terms of its variety within it, meaning there are a lot of different Dzogchen lineages. Some of them are very tightly bound to the rest of Vajrayana. Some of them are less so. And of course, Dzogchen is also considered a teaching within the Bon religion in Tibet, which is which claims to not be a Buddhist religion. So Dzogchen has a lot of variety. So searchless responsiveness could be interpreted as an essentialized form of Dzogchen, or it could be interpreted as the union of the option method and the classical work of Wilhelm Reich. And I'm just giving you two different perspectives. I don't think either of those, or it could be viewed as the essentialized teachings of Ari Da without his high modernist end goal. In other words, Ari Da was fundamentally high modern, meaning he had a structure, and like Ken Wilber is, he had a structure, an elaborate structure, and this was the ultimate elaborate structure, as opposed to being postmodern in the classical sense of postmodern, where there is no master narrative. So I think all these three things will be equally true, or you can even do a Venn diagram and say, what can be said equally about Dzogchen and the union of the option method and Reichian breathwork, and about the teachings of Ari Da, and maybe searchless responsiveness is at the then intersection of those three things.
You know what was popping up now? I'm curious. Do you subscribe somewhat to the perennialist philosophy, or do you feel like they're not all paths pointing to the same thing?
I absolutely feel that all paths point to different places.
Yeah, so you don't subscribe to it. Yeah,
and I'll give you a academic technical reason why, which is that if they went to all the same place, then you'd have some sort of ultimate non-duality. But non-duality and duality are inseparable. So we never find non-duality not intermixed with duality. You never find, I call it non-dualism. Non-dualism, you've probably heard of dualism. People are like, well, you're being dualistic in your philosophy. Well, non-dualism is projecting that everything is the same onto everything. So Perennialism is a form of non-dualism, and I promulgate the inseparability of non-duality and duality. So I am against non-dualism.
Yeah, no, I love this. And just today, I'm part of another sangha, and somebody shared. I'm trying to. What was the guy's name? Sean what was his name? Harbemas. I'm forgetting the guy's name, but he somebody shared like a course that he's an integral guy, and he made a course on like all these different non-dualities, and it's kind of based on David Loy's book Non-Duality, but he expands on that, and he's showing all these different traditions and how there's different interpretations or different versions of non-duality. So I feel like that's what you're speaking to.
Yeah, but let's get more specific. Even for one person, let's take you point at some guy who's quote unquote has a non-dual realization. That non-dual realization, it can never be separated from the context of that person while they're taking a shit, the context of the person while they're eating lunch, the context of the person while they're on the internet. It's sort of like looking at a actual physical structure and then abstracting into mathematics and saying the mathematics are the same. And the mathematics, like, oh, all these rooms are perfect, are quote unquote squares. They're all 10 by 10. But we don't ever visit a 10 by 10 square room in that abstract sense. We always visit a concrete room that has, particular paint on it, particular texture on the walls, particular furnishings. So even a single person, a moment by moment, the non-duality is not fully separable from duality, from the actual context of their circumstances.
Yeah, I just want to mention the guy's name. It's Sean Esborn Hargens, and he's like an expert on integral theory, but he's also a longtime meditator. And yeah, just interesting that he's teaching this course on all these things. But what you were just saying right now, also it makes me think about some of what Rob Burbea would say about awakening, how it's always filtered through the person's lived experience. And he's like, well, you have this teacher, and like look at how they describe it, look how they talk about it, and then you have this teacher, look at like how they're saying it. There's a unique flavor to it. It's not the exact same thing.
Yes, I mean, abstract math is sort of a flavorless version of reality, which is very useful, but realization is always flavored. And for example, if you have a teacher who is a cheery person or a really forceful person, that may not come from the realization. That may be how the realization filters through their body mind. And the idea that, oh, that person's so cheerful, or that person's always smiling, or that person's so forceful and gets things done and cuts through shit, that if I had that realization, I'd be like that. That's a false delusion. When maybe you'll become the Platonic ideal of your innate temperament, but what that looks like, I mean, someone can have an innate temperament that is vaguely depressed and weepy, and you can actually have a non-dual realization and be vaguely depressed and weepy all the time, and these two actually are not contradictory.
Yeah, I love it. And so do you feel like the non-dualism, it's kind of like it's just something you have to go through? Do you feel like you were at that place before you got to the place of realizing that there's different flavors of non-duality?
I don't think so, but that's because of my lineage of non-duality was first introduced. I'm using that term. That was not a term Arida used, but there was always the idea in my lineages that any final realization would always be highly flavored by the body mind that it came in, and therefore you could never look to outward characteristics in a very explicit checklist way to make any judgments about what was going on.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk a little bit more about searchless responsiveness and what was coming up. I think it would a way to understand it is to maybe give an example of what is contrary to that. I think you call the search instead of searchlessness is the search.
Well, let me use an example as a parent. Um, so, as a parent, you or as a manager at work, things happen. You have an agenda. You're like, oh, I didn't like the way things are going. I'd like things to go a different way. Um, and there's a sense, maybe you know that sense of when you have an agenda and it feels compulsive, like I have an agenda and I really need for this agenda to happen. I really need for, let's say, if when they're young, my toddler to stop crying. I really need for this person at work um, to mention me in the emails instead of keep on taking credit for my work, something like that. And that compulsion is what the search is. It's not having an agenda, it's having a compulsion about an agenda. And here's the thing, when that sense of compulsion about agenda in all life altogether is dropped, thing is, there's still agendas, there's still motion, but it can become fluid because when it becomes easy to move in a direction and then respond to whatever actually happens in the world and change and modify the direction. There's no fixity of directionality. So the two things that are contrary to searchlessness are either one, a compulsive sense, a very existentially compulsive, like I need this direction to succeed, or the the sort of Theravedic or Hinayana Buddhist failure from searchlessness would be going for cessation, where directionality altogether is made a bad thing, and you're trying to eliminate all directionality. So what we're looking for is the ability to have directionality without any sense of compulsion or absolute existential necessity around it.
Yeah, so there's still an agenda. It's just I want this, but if it doesn't happen, I'm okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So,
and by the way, that was summarized by Bruce Di Marsico as, and the sequence is important here: be happy, and do what you want. So the be happy, that is, you don't have any conditions that must be fulfilled before you can be happy. So you have nothing that must happen, but then you do what you want. But the thing is that do what you want is very different in vibe and feel than when do what you want in order to become happy. You're doing what you want on the foundation that however it goes, it's going to be fine. And you have preferences. You'd rather that you really want the butter pecan ice cream. You'd love it if they had it in the stock. Maybe you get to the store, they're out. Okay, well, tonight it's not butter pecan. It's just chocolate or rum raisin.
okay, yeah. So, a lot of this, it really makes sense because, right, like the idea that you can't be happy through external means, like that's, it's just like a truism at this point. Like everybody says it, everybody on some level knows it, but it's almost like people don't know how to function in a different way. It's like we can't disentangle happiness from the things we do. It's like, oh, everything we're doing is to feel a particular way. It's like,
yeah, well, there's two things. I'm going to bookmark them here so I get back to them. One is unhappiness is motivation, and two is the God realms. So unhappiness motivation is the fact that a common motivational strategy is to be unhappy about something, think of something as a reason for unhappiness in order to motivate. Like, I wish I'm unhappy that I sleep in as a motivator to wake up earlier. And the understanding that that's just unnecessary. That you don't, unhappiness is actually, it is an effective motivator. That's why people use it. But it's not you could actually do the same motion without unhappiness as a motivator. So like take off your head and throw it over there and be like, oh my God, I got to run after my head. But in spirituality, I often use very complex examples. So let me generalize this up to spirituality in the broad sense. In spirituality, there is the search in the God realms, and what that means is many traditions posit an ideal state. People follow that tradition and say like, here's where I need to go. I need to go to that ideal state, and maybe I need to achieve jhanas 1 through 4 through 8. I need to achieve cessation. The Dzogchen realization and searchlessness are both the realization that there is nowhere that you need to be. It's a funny thing that and that includes states of bliss, states of cessation, states of clarity. There is a bliss mentioned in Dzogchen, and I would translate it as, it's called, there's names 4 blisses, and it's the bliss of freedom from existential anxiety. That's how I translate it. And what that means is like whatever state you're in, that's okay. And maybe in that state, you'd like a different state, and you move toward that state. But there's never a problem that you're in the state you're in. So that is searchlessness. Searchlessness is not a state. It is not trying to fall out of all states in some sort of cessation. It is the complete embrace of the complete embrace of whatever state you're in, including how that state has directionality that drives you towards other states.
That also, there's multiple pieces where you write this, that it's like every state is included, and it reminded me of this Ram Dass quote. He was like, "The world is perfect as it is, including my desire to want to change it." So it's interesting.
That's a great quote. Yeah,
and the I want to come back to the motivation, because there was a thread around that I was interested in. But first, I want to touch on, there's so many pieces around searchless responsiveness, and like one of them is around identity and self and conceptuality, and it's really interesting how you talk about that. But I think, sometimes identity and self, people kind of just lump those together. I think you were saying that self is like a feeling. It's like a subjective experience of what it's like to be somebody, or like a particular pattern of interaction. And then an identity was like an orientation, or maybe a fixation to a pattern of interactions.
Yeah. So like, let me try to make an analogy. When you talk about a city, where do you live? You live in Brooklyn or something?
Yeah.
Brooklyn. You talk about Brooklyn. We know that Brooklyn has historically changed. So Brooklyn, as a pointer, changes. Brooklyn of 1850, of the gangs of New York, whatever. By the way, I had a time in Brooklyn. I used to live on Avenue X back in the 90s.
That's crazy.
Used to sell mace and beer on Brighton Beach back in the day.
I love it, man.
Yeah, and I think here the Jewish mafia helped protect us a little bit from the Italian mafia, because the ice cream vendor was like, "You're stepping on my turf," and he was with the Italian folks. Anyway, you talk about Brooklyn, it's always legit to talk about Brooklyn, but if someone just said, "Let's talk about Brooklyn historically," you'd want to know what exact moment, because it's not, Brooklyn has changed incessantly, and you can point at it, but it's hard to say what is exactly the same between Brooklyn of 1850 and Brooklyn of 2024. There are things you could identify as continuous, and many things that have changed. Now, you probably are all sorts of, in every era, there's always been those who might have clamored for the preservation of the identity of Brooklyn. So they're choosing certain aspects of its current endless fluid transformation and declaring those things should be fixed eternally. Let's say the characteristic of Brooklyn is the wooden roller coaster at Coney Island. Well, I think that burnt down twice and then hasn't been replaced for, I think maybe I've been there for a long time, but maybe it's not a wooden roller coaster. But as someone who has that as the identity of Brooklyn would insist that Coney Island's wooden roller coaster is an intrinsic part of what could be pointed to as Brooklyn and should always be there. So we talk about the self. It's like a city. It's always changing. There's parts that you can identify as continuous and parts that change, that don't change. And so self is what we call a pointer or indexical. And there's nothing, you can't even say there's nothing wrong with self. That's like saying there's something wrong with pointing over there and say that's Brooklyn. Identity can be problematic because it's often associated with attempt to fix guaranteed, eternally fixed parts of that pattern. And that, of course, creates friction in responsiveness and in being in the world because, as you can see with development, anything that's you try to keep permanently fixed eventually just isn't appropriate anymore.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how identity becomes a problem and having a fixed self. Like if I have a certain self-image or a certain self that I like or I want to inhabit, and then I'm in an interaction and that, that's not getting propped up or that's not getting reflected, then I feel upset or maybe I don't like that person. Now I don't want to come around them because they're not reflecting, me in a particular way that I like to see. So I see how that, having a rigid self or having favorite selves and then not wanting to, feel a different flavor of self that might arise in an interaction because the self is not within me. It's not there's no inherent self. It's an interaction between environments and relationships and people.
Mm-hmm. And identity can also be positively a generative thing. So, you can take on identity as something like I am a podcaster, and that identity leads you into podcasting. So the question I don't think there's anything problematic intrinsically with identity. It's just that the level of, again, we always get to fixity or compulsion. It's the compulsion plus identity. So compulsion identity is not only here is what we're trying to create as a stable pattern of selfing, and this really needs to stay stable, as opposed to sort of like, oh yes, let's try to build a stable house and hopefully it'll work out. So identity can be used generatively, but that sense of, that feeling of, oh, this wounded my identity, that only occurs because there's a compulsive or fixed attempt to have the identity be stable, stay there, not merely as a focus, but as a permanent eternal thing, as a soul, as they used to call it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you bring up how identity could be used in a positive way. And I feel like, like in a lot of like productivity literature and stuff like that, they actually say that if you want to achieve a particular goal, it makes sense to have a certain identity, but it's very easy for it to go overboard. And, like I can give an example from my own life. I was very into lifting weights for a long time, right? Like I developed a strong identity of like, I'm somebody who works out, I'm somebody who's fit. But then if I ever got sick or I got hurt and I couldn't lift, there was like some kind of distress. It's like, oh my God, I'm not going to go to the gym for a week. And it's actually interesting now because during COVID, I ended up, my body had like a freak reaction, which like damaged my spine and basically made it really difficult to walk. So I can't really lift weights or do any of the stuff that I used to do. And it's just kind of life was like, yeah, you can't do it anyway. Now you really can't do it. But I just remember how like that slowly fell away. But I remember there would literally there was such a rigid identity around that if I got sick or I got hurt and I couldn't lift, it was like, oh my God, that now I won't be big or I won't be strong or whatever, you know?
Yeah, and there can be a playful and welcoming and warm identity as a lifter that can be very positive. So the in general, the line between the single thing that is to be rooted out, or that is what is the problem in the grand sense. I think I would say, if I had to say what is the problem, is any sense of existential compulsion. And the thing about anything that when there's no existential compulsion, that actually doesn't look like anything in particular, because we're just saying, well, states move freely, or this way or that way, identities move freely, the self moves freely. We're just not trying to lock it all down as a sort of function of oh my God, it's got to be this way. So it doesn't necessarily look hardly at all different than ordinary life, though from the inside, ordinary life now feels generally fantastic, whether you are sick with COVID or or having explosive diarrhea, or having someone on the street yell at you for having not for having driven your car in a way they don't like. It's it's all good.
Yeah, I feel like that is like a common saying where it's like nothing changes, but everything changes. And I think in your writing, there was like a piece you said, like, it's like you still have the same states, but it's like the way you relate to them is different. So you could still have that sadness or the fear, but you relate to it different. And I think one of the things you said is like the recognition of the nature of states. It's like knowing like this is not what it is. This is not the truth. It's just it's just a state that's going to change. That's transitional.
Yeah, or it's not eternal. It's not. There's never. It just yeah. And then and then what do you do with life? It's a responsive play. That's what responsiveness. Becomes a responsive play, because there really isn't that much separation between self or me and context or something like that. So what happens is there's nothing that can really be said, and every given person, their responsive play will look differently once they are no longer trying to cram an agenda down their psyche, something like that.
Yeah. So maybe we could talk a little bit about like your personal practice and how that's kind of evolved over the years. Maybe
Sure.
you could, yeah, I think you also mentioned like something that retreat you did with Keith Dowman that was like very profound or something like that, or it seemed pretty intense.
I've been meditating now I started out, my first meditation was standard classic breath meditation. And actually my first meditation was probably guitar scale meditation, the meditation of actually maintaining focus and presence in playing scales. So that in some sense is a little bit of a traditional spiritual activity. Nowadays, my main meditations are driven by what I am presenting or asked to present next. So, for example, in the Bay Area, I have like this monthly thing I do in Berkeley, and even though it wouldn't be what I would do if I was without that, but I do I do those meditations I'm going to be presenting. And then I'm leading a book club right now on Keith Dowman's work, actually, and each one's about a different practice. So right now I'm doing sky gazing because that's relevant to the next session. And so I think that Keith, this particular practice that you mentioned, outer Khorde Rushen, will be interesting to your listeners, because everyone loves stuff that has dramatic stuff in it. So what is it's actually rather hard to generate interest just talking about sitting on your ass being silent. So Khorde Rushen is a practice that's about realizing that all states are, that liberation is available in all states. And the traditional way to do it is you would, in Tibet, is you would find a space that had no one around, because it can be very antisocial. So you actually handle that by being away from society, and bring your own food, and you do it for 3 months. Generally, it's done primarily naked. Because one of the factors one of the primary factors for many people is social considerations and how they are bondage or binding. And the thing is, I think it's useful to shoehorn a 3-part perspective of relationship to society in here, which is the child obeys society. They do as society tells them. The adolescent is the inverse of that. They act against society. If society says wear a suit, they wear leather and earrings. If society says get a job, they're like, no fucking way. And in this model, the adult here, which is a symbolic adult and not is someone who just considers what's useful, what's appropriate, what's beautiful in the context. And sometimes that will line up with society. Sometimes it will be against society. Sometimes it'll be neither. It'll be something that's orthogonal to both. And so it's not caught up in the mesh of either obedience or reactivity. It's free to move, including free to move in the same direction of society or against it. So being naked is, of course, for many people is during the daytime outdoors is a very confronting activity. Though if you live in Northern California, you go to Harbin Hot Springs, I used to do all the time, then you get used to folks wandering around naked everywhere. Anyway, it's traditionally done naked. And what do you do? Well, there's structured and there's unstructured. In structured Khorde Rushen, in all these Khorde Rushen, the main activity is that you enact a way of being. And this way of being could be something that's very abstract, such as the way of the realm of the gods. Like, for example, the way of being could be doing a meditative state, like going to a jhana. And I've done that one. And then finding liberation within it. Or it could be something like, oh, there's something about that my neighbor did that irritated me, and let me actually find identification with that, with my neighbor's actions, and be in that realm of I am my neighbor doing that, and then liberate within that. Or it could simply be something like, oh, what's really different than me is the life of a goat. What is it to enact being a goat until you're totally in that goat vibe, and then find liberation there. Each once you get the groove, it becomes your circumstance for basically basic meditation, where you're just no different than a seated meditation. So you're finding all these different contexts, going into all these different contexts, dramatically enacting them, and then finding liberation there, freedom there. And there's generally a structured, the two main categories are structured, which is basically you're given the list of the things to go into, sort of scale. Like, for example, one of them is say the 9 dances of the Dakini, which include, erotic, dancing freely in an erotic manner, dancing freely in a disgusted manner, dancing freely in a wrathful manner. But unstructured is really going wherever it interests you, and with lots of time, you will quickly run out of the easy ones, and then you'll be able to explore more and more interesting things now that you've burned through the easy ones. So that's a summary of Rushen. And again, the point of Rushen is to find liberation in every state. Being a goat, that's cool. Being my angry neighbor, that's cool. And the last Rushen retreat I did, for example, had a woman who actually spent, as I think, she's, you do this separate from people, but I did find out that she spent a lot of time enacting her rapist, finding liberation in that. In other words, she'd already cleared up her side of things, and again, to find liberation doesn't predicate anything about action. Like if I enact Hitler, that means I can both see through Hitler's eyes, and it has no impact on the question of like, if I was in 1945, do I shoot him in the head? You could actually enact violence against people you're completely sympathetic for reasons of the well-being of all others. Finding sympathy, universal sympathy in Rushen, doesn't entail that one loses the capability to take practical action for the benefit of all. And sometimes, in classical literature of Vajrayana, there are cases of there's a famous, I think it's Milarepa, whatever. Someone basically, he murdered 3 people, then he got converted and did stuff, and then he killed 3 more people. And it was noted that the 3 people he killed before liberation were karmic. In other words, he shouldn't have killed those people. It was damaging to his psyche. The 3 ones he killed after liberation were not karmic because it was responding to this situation. It was not some thief jumps out with a knife to try to stab your partner and you kill them. And so noting that, for example, there's no practical action entailed in finding sympathy with someone. You can have total sympathy for someone and still find it's appropriate and necessary to enact violence against them.
Yeah, this Khorde Rushen sounds like a radical shadow work, and it to come back to Ram Dass, I think he had this saying. He's like, you could protest whoever you want, but you just have to love them first. And I don't know.
Ram Dass had a lot of good sayings. I'm serious. I'm like, I've all heard these things, but you're bringing them back up in this context, and I'm like, I'm appreciating them again because I haven't heard them in long decades, and like, wow, it has new resonance when you're bringing them up right now. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's one of my favorite spiritual teachers. I always appreciated Ram Dass. So here's another thread, and I guess this is going back to motivation. Right. And this is an idea I've been thinking about for a while. And I wonder how it's going to land for you and how you would see it from searchless responsiveness. So it's basically this notion of greatness versus wholeness. And I mean greatness in kind of the conventional, I guess wholeness can be a kind of greatness, but greatness in the conventional sense is when somebody excels or becomes world class in a particular avenue. And my favorite example of that is the 3 Mikes. So Michael Jordan, Mike Tyson, Michael Jackson, for most of their lives, they're each very focused on excelling in a particular way of being. So they become very good at inhabiting a particular self. So in contrast, it seems to me that an orientation like searchless responsiveness, it's a lot like more holistic in the sense that you're seemingly moving between different selves without becoming fixated or attached to a particular way of being. So do you think there would be a conflict between like becoming world class in a particular avenue and orientation like searchless responsiveness? So it almost feels like for somebody to become great at something, it's almost like there's a battle of selves, right? And you're like, all right, I have to be a father and I have to do this and I have to be a friend. And there's all these selves. And then it's like, well, I'm really good at basketball, like, Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant, like, I'm going to sacrifice, I'm cutting off all these things and I'm just going all in on this particular self.
I don't see them as contradictory, but let me elaborate on that. Some people are temperamentally suited to certain things. Let's say boxing, like Mike Tyson. When and other people see, let's say, Mike Tyson, and be like, I wish I was like Mike. So the question is, when you don't feel any compulsion about things, will you still want to be like Mike or not? And that varies by person. I think in our society, people become archetypes or role models, and let's say tons of people want to be like them. Searchless responsiveness would probably filter things out, and you'd still have a few who that was their, I'll say, authentic path. So I'd say that searchless responsiveness or wholeness separates out, focus on wholeness separates out those who are not temperamentally or naturally inclined towards a particular form of greatness. I have no idea if Michael Jordan or Mike Tyson or who's the third, Michael Jackson, where they would go, but it's quite possible that they would be exactly as they are. On the other hand, many people who idolize them and quote, want to be like them, or if you read the internet, there's a period when a lot of people want to be Steve Jobs or whatever. Many of those people would probably fall away because they didn't want to be that. They were just sort of memed into it by society.
Yeah. So searchless responsiveness can free somebody from this kind of compulsion and from buying into a particular meme, or I really want to be like this. Because it seems to me another thing that's difficult to navigate is desire. Like, desire is very difficult because, like, well, what is your authentic or true desire? And like, what is like being like the whole notion of mimetic desire, that we're kind of like these ideas are implanted, and then you think you want to be Michael Jordan, or you think you want to be Mike Tyson or Steve Jobs or whoever, and it's not like an authentic or true desire.
And one thing is in that freeing of desire to be Mike Tyson, perhaps you can find out what it means to be Ari Nielsen or Artem Zen in their fullest flourishing. So, the thing is, desires are just like anything else. They're not of ourselves, and they're not of the outside world. Though in extreme, the two extreme ideas are all desire as mimetic desire and planted by society. Society's make you want this, make you want that, or all desires is self-generated, when, like almost everything else, they're actually a very complex fluid flow between inside and outside. You could ask, if you look at everybody in the world and you said, what would it mean for them to become the ideal version of them? When I say ideal, is like in some sort of, not to anyone, it's sort of abstract. Like, what is the perfection of Artem Zen? What is the perfection of Ari Nielsen? I think a lot of people would end up being very interesting in ways that they wouldn't be otherwise. But we would find new heroes amongst all those people who fully became themselves. And many other people would not be socially heroes. They simply be okay with being whatever they are, because that's their fullest form. Their fullest form is to contribute to society with a job and enjoy a meal with their family.
Yeah, what you're saying, it's also that like desires co-arise. Like if Michael Jordan was born at a time when there was no basketball, well, he wouldn't have been the Michael Jordan we know. He would have probably pursued something else. So there's this relationship of looking out and looking in, and it seems like if somebody focuses too much outside, there's a potential of focusing too much outside or focusing too much in. I don't know if there's like a right relationship between outside and inside. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, the thing is, responsiveness is surrendering to the context, responding to the context. So there's not much thought or planning in it at many levels. There can be planning or thought, but at a moment-to-moment level, it's simply taking the river that you find yourself in and deciding which way is swimmable or you wish to swim within the river. And at any given moment, not every direction is swimmable.
Yeah. So there's another thread that's been coming up for me, and I've been thinking about this, and like it seems to me that a lot of mental health issues are related to patterns of perfectionism, and we could kind of also relate that to an inner critic. And more I'm starting to think that a lot of spiritual work is kind of seeing through that inner critic. And you had a couple of pieces where you speak about kind of seeing through perfectionism or letting go of it, in the sense of, I think you mentioned like trying to be completely unfucked up will actually make you fucked up.
For sure. Yeah.
Or you spoke about the utility of deliberately like falling off the wagon. Like the way I related that was like bodybuilders, they plan to have a cheat meal and it actually ends up being more beneficial to their physique and performance than if they ate 100% clean at a time. So those pieces to me feel like an encouragement to accept and even lean into messiness and imperfection and not try to like get the kink out of the carpet, which I feel like we try to do. And that relates to you also talking about the ideal state, like getting to this place where everything's perfect.
The thing is, releasing existential compulsion or existential necessity can become a compulsion or a felt sense of necessity. There's this sort of recursive thing there. So there's always got to be a play between releasing these forms of compulsion and not getting compulsive about releasing forms of compulsion. It's related to the idea that any form of meditation in Dzogchen, any form, can become contrived, meaning it becomes, instead of what it was trying to do, it becomes a sort of imitation of what it was trying to do. And that is one reason why in Dzogchen there's often a lot of change of method or oscillation of method, because if you do any meditation too consistently for too long, it almost always ends up becoming a impotent imitation of the form.
Okay, that really makes sense, because I've definitely had periods in my practice where it seems like I lose the motivation and things get stagnant. It's really interesting about like switching up practices and doing different practices, and even like what you were talking about with the Khorde Rushen, like that's not something you would consider like a meditation. Like running around naked, doing weird stuff. But it is. It can be a meditation, and it can be something that actually invigorates one's practice, being able to do different types of meditation.
Yeah. I think for me nowadays, my central meditations would be extremely quiet meditations. But, there's just, it's almost like taking a shower. It's like, that you can take a shower. You don't worry about getting dirty, because even if you had explosive diarrhea in the car, you'll come home, you'll take a shower, it'll be all cleaned up. Maybe you have to take it to the car wash. A little pain in the ass, but even those worst circumstances, you'll be clean again soon enough. Okay. And you probably expect to be clean, relatively clean your whole life, and you expect to be clean enough your whole life. So I think an attitude of this stuff's all about, in some senses, about existential relaxation. So an attitude of of becoming more relaxed and good enough is good enough is sort of the whole meta relaxed attitude that leads to more relaxation than, let's say, someone who went to a yoga training and got really fixated on the corpse pose, and you can tell they're a really tense person because they're always fixated on relaxing. I'm just thinking now of like there's a film called The Big Lebowski, and there's a scene where the guy's like, he gets really, he's like, relax, just relax, man, relax. He gets the whole stereotype of getting completely agitated over the concept of someone else relaxing.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's several threads, but maybe we'll start winding down right now. And this one is, I'm kind of selfish. I don't know if everybody listening to this not everybody listening to this has kids, but this is interesting to me because you have a daughter, you have a teenage daughter, and I have two boys. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. So you're kind of farther along on that parenting journey. And, you speak to parenting in a couple of pieces, and I've seen you write about it also in the EG forum. And I know you also, you did some meetups in Evolving Ground around parenting, which I would have loved to join, but they didn't work with me time-wise.
Yeah, I'm vaguely, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm curious, just like, what are some lessons you learned through your parenting journey? What do you think are some helpful orientations or principles? Like, what's worked for you? I'm touched about like some of the things you said. I think there was a piece you were talking about screen. There was one in particular you were talking about screen time and how you allowed your daughter to kind of just figure out for herself like what's too much. And that seems very kind of counterintuitive to what most people would do, where they would kind of impose, be like, you could only have this much. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just curious to kind of hear your perspective. It sounds different. I know you spoke about also unschooling, and for me and my wife, that's also like a thread that we're like, yeah, we're down with. But yeah.
So I've a particular aesthetic of parenting, and I want to clarify that that it is not
It's not for everybody.
It's not for everybody. It's not the ultimate. So I'm going to describe this as the way I do things. And so, first of all, I'm vaguely affiliated with a movement called Taking Children Seriously, which is founded by Sarah Fitzclarage and David Deutsch. That's the same David Deutsch who wrote Beginning of Infinity, but he's never compiled in the book. He's written a lot of stuff on it, but it's only available as his web postings. It's not available in a book. And the principle of taking children seriously is simply that that one is able to respect the point of view of a child at all ages. Even like when they're young, they crying and they want their diaper changed or something. Now, but respect doesn't mean necessarily
permissiveness.
Doesn't mean do, because the analogy is always, what will you do with a peer? Like if you want to go to restaurant A and your friend wants to go to restaurant B, it doesn't mean you always go to restaurant B. Or that you go to restaurant A. You simply take their point of view seriously. I am taking, you take seriously that they want to go to restaurant B, and then you figure out, well, what are we going to do given that I want to go to restaurant A and you want to go to restaurant B? And that may look very different when you're talking with let's say a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old. So the practical advice I have from that is that always is to draw your line of what is what you can just leave be as small as possible. Keep your unacceptable field as small as possible. So, and that is a discovery in everyone's case.
It's like the opposite of helicopter parenting.
Yeah. The second thing is I really appreciate this sequence called Friend Model Guide. I use that, which is if I want to guide, if I want to get the credence of being a guide, of being a consultant or whatever to my children, then I have to model. I have to, demonstrate that I'm walking my talk. So walking my talk gives me credence to give advice. And of course, I can't guarantee my advice will be taken, but at least it gives me the legitimacy. Now, to walk for anyone to care about me walking my talk, I have to be a friend. So, friend, model, guide. First, be a friend, and then live what your point of view, and then people might actually listen to you when you talk. And I think that's true of much of adults. I mean, people tend to listen to advice from people who they think are like authentically living that approach, and they like. I had a thought there, and it vanished out of my mind. With advice, I find it very important. I believe this is a key thing in my philosophy, is that to always, whenever I have a request that is charged, it's especially important to meditate and to release all necessity that it go my way in my heart. So if I'm going to say, I'd like you to do the dishes, you're leaving your dishes in the sink, the first thing is I really have to have in my heart the possibility that I will get, I don't want to do that. And that's okay. Now, from that point of view, I might continue negotiation, but it's like a negotiation with a autonomous peer, meaning it's up to me to influence, to persuade the person, the child, to do as I'd like, and I have to be always available to the fact that I may not succeed. Like, guys, I think we should go to Restaurant A. And let me tell you, Restaurant A is full of delicious food, and maybe it's a group circumstance, and at the end of the day, you didn't convince people. There's a group of 10, and everyone else, nope, we're going to Restaurant B, and that's fine. It's not like a problem. So both be willing to influence, but with first in your heart, no necessity that you get your way. And finally, there's a little caveat to that. And if it doesn't go your way, you can keep on influencing. You don't have to stop. So you always keep on influencing. You always, in every moment of influence, you're also okay with that it hasn't gone your way.
Yeah, no, I very much resonate with that approach. And I think I'm trying to do something similar. And definitely when there's moments where you try to influence them and they don't listen, and it's like you're tired and you're trying to find creative ways to get them to do the thing that you think is the right thing. It can be hard, but definitely try to try to get them to come to that conclusion on their own. Try to get them to realize and make that choice without like forcing them to make a particular choice.
But the essential thing in the vibe, and because if you actually feel that it's got to go my way, they can always feel that. They can always feel when you say something like, "Will you wash the? Would you wash it?"
You ask them to wash the dishes, but you say it in a way where it's like a demand.
Well, you say it in a way that's like not a demand, like, will you wash the dishes? But actually they can feel that no is not an acceptable answer. They can feel that. You ask like it was a yes, no question, but because you cannot disguise, no matter how you do your voice tone or whatever, if you actually have, whether this is a real question or really a demand disguised as a question, they can always feel that. And I think that's a good principle. That it's a good working principle to presume that your kids can always feel exactly what's in your heart. So whatever words or behavior or voice tone you put on to try to deceive them and present things differently, that they're going to still smell or feel right through that and know what you're actually feeling and thinking.
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of evidence about that, how children are super perceptive and sensitive, and they can just like feel a lot of these things. So that makes sense. So I'll ask one more follow up on this because I'm very interested. I think you said that. Well, how old is your daughter? You said she's 15.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you said she only recently started to go into school. So
she stopped again. Yeah. So we did no school, or including no homeschooling, through what would be conventionally through 7th grade. At that point, she wanted to go to school because her cousin goes to school and her cousin likes school a lot. So she wanted to investigate school. She went to school in 8th. So we did 10 weeks of prep over the summer. And caught up, 7 years and 10 weeks. It was not that hard because school goes really slowly. And then then she went to 8th grade, and then she went to 9th grade, and she got like a 4.0 grade point average. And it's like, you know what? This isn't that interesting, you know? And she, she had 4.0 grade average. She participated in, she was in a special theater program. Also did very excellent theater stuff. So she made friends, all that stuff. Had a great school experience, but nonetheless, thing is, it's someone else's vision. It's not your vision. Someone else's vision, even if their vision is somehow, let's say it was perfectly benign, you can complain about it. It's still, think about your friend. Think about a friend of yours who has a job they like. Think about if you were actually placed in that job, how you may not enjoy it as much as they do. And it's not a complaint about that job, and not a complaint about your friend. It's a statement about fit, and it's not your vision. So she stopped school again after 2 years of very successful schooling, and now is back to doing her own thing. Like right now, I think her main activities is she's doing ballroom dancing. She's doing AP Physics 1 scholastically. She's taking a lot of walks down to the local French bakery. She's cooking. Just the point of that is, right behind me is she collected some hornworms from the yard. She's like doing a hornworm thing. And the point is that she's doing a little bit of academics, but that's completely, I'd be fine if she did zero academics. It's just, she's back to just doing whatever her vision is. And that's about that.
So it's like, I guess, you start school, like my son just started kindergarten. You start like at 5. So from 5, she was home and just kind of like follow your curiosity, kind of follow what, wherever your heart goes, kind of like do.
Yeah, that could be things that like are conventionally thought of pretty poorly, probably by parents. Like there was a time when she was playing a lot of Minecraft every day. There's also a time when she was actually, she joined a lot of nature programs. She's spending all day in the woods. So the thing is there's really no grand consistent set of behaviors. Doing her own thing could look like spending all day. Like she's still very, very good at identifying bird calls and understanding footprints in the ground. It could be spending the time in nature. It could be playing Minecraft, playing video games. There's really no reason to prefer one activity over the other. It's all good. It's all development of personal taste, all development of personal vision.
Yeah. So it seems like why this wouldn't work for most people, and maybe why it's worked for you, is because you trust that her life will work out in the way it needs to work out. But it seems like for other people, I think you mentioned this, that, well, I think you were saying it with the vision. You have your own vision. So even as a parent, you have a vision for the path your child should take, but that's not necessarily their vision or not necessarily what their path is.
I'm all for public schools. I'm all for. I believe that society, it's useful in society to have a default mode. Not everyone is temperamentally inclined to have their own vision, and that's fine. And one thing society can do is provide default structures that work pretty well. So that's why it's not suited for everybody. It works well for me because I am somebody who tends to have their own vision. My daughter is temperamentally the same way. My wife is temperamentally the same way. So it all works out to a good degree. But there's if there was a magic libertarian society where everyone was expected to have their own vision, you might see a lot of folks not really having a good time because they would not have their own vision, and the default vision of society, there would be none, and they'd wander aimlessly, suffering.
Yeah, I know. I appreciate that perspective. And so maybe we could finish off with leaving the listeners with like a practice Like what they a simple practice, because you speak about different practices. What would be a simple practice they can do that can help them get a taste of searchless responsiveness?
Well, I'll give you two simple ones. For one of them may feel more mental, one of them feel more physical. For searchlessness, I just say notice whenever you have that feeling of compulsion, and it's this very subtle mental move. Just relax. I'm just here to I'm more here to say that when you relax your compulsive way you're living in life, it doesn't take away your ability to do things. It doesn't even, it's just a difference between wanting to get a job and compulsively wanting to get a job. There's no difference. Both you want to get a job, except one you're adding feeling like shit on top of it. That's all, So I don't really have a practice there. I'm just maybe talking about the essence of you that frankly, for many people, this can, the cognitive side of it, like, just basically like I described there, is a great starter. Meditation is a more advanced, deeper way, but you can start as just like cognitively noting that, oh, I feel a compulsion here. What would it be to relax this compulsion and just be with this desire without having it be a compulsive desire, just a desire, a free desire, a liberated desire, a playful desire. Now that really was an exercise. So let me see if I have the exercise. Maybe I can come up with an exercise for responsiveness, and that one is sort of like the essence of body, and that is occasionally try acting before you think. Like just that's the exercise. Go out there, like and just find that edge of, like, maybe just form the intention, as I walk down this block, I'm going to do some acting before I think. And you might find yourself, let's say, kicking a rock, or you might find yourself saying, yo, bro, to a homeless guy. Who knows what it looks like? Just like setting the attention to act before you think, and finding out what it means just to be straightforwardly responsive with the world. Thinking is useful stuff. I am not against thinking, but it's a useful activity in conjunction with the intuitive bodily mode. So for the general person in New York City, I'm guessing acting before you think is probably a useful experiment.
Very, very counterintuitive. Okay, so yeah, man, really appreciate you coming on. I feel like we touched on a lot of subjects. We spoke about Ari Da, Bruce Di Marsico and the option method, searchless responsiveness, identity, self, perfectionism, unschooling. So really appreciate you weaving all these threads with me. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap up?
And well, I enjoyed your interview. So it was nice hanging out with you this October morning.
Yeah, it was great to get to know you more, and I hope to interact more since we're both a part of EG. So look forward to that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, brother. Appreciate you.